beam of my flashlight cut through the murky water, illuminating particles suspended in the darkness like tiny stars. I'd dreamed of this moment for years, exploring the depths of Crystal Lake, a place steeped in legend and terror. As I descended deeper, the weight of the water pressed against my wetsuit, a constant reminder of the danger lurking in this watery tomb. "Jack, you reading me?" Dave's voice crackled through my earpiece, distorted by the water but still audible, loud and clear. I replied, my words slightly muffled by the regulator in my mouth. "I'm about 30 feet down now. Visibility's not great, but I'm managing." "Roger that. Remember, we're just here to survey and document. No heroics, all right." I chuckled, expelling a stream of bubbles that raced to the surface. "Come on, Dave. You know me better than that." But even as I said it, I felt a familiar thrill of excitement. We weren't just any diving team. We were here to uncover the truth behind the Crystal Lake murders, to find evidence of the legendary Jason Voorhees. It was the holy grail of urban exploration, and we were on the cusp of making history. The lake bottom came into view, a wasteland of silt and decaying vegetation. My fins kicked up clouds of sediment as I moved forward, scanning the area methodically. Fragments of the old camp littered the lakebed, a rusted canoe paddle here, the remains of a dock there. Each object told a story, a snapshot of lives abruptly ended decades ago. As I swam, the temperature seemed to drop. I shivered. Despite my wetsuit, something about this place felt wrong. The water was too still, the silence too complete. Even the fish seemed to have abandoned this part of the lake. "Guys, I'm picking up some strange readings," Sarah's voice came through, tight with tension. She was monitoring our vital signs and environmental data from the boat. "There's a cold spot about 20 feet ahead of you, Jack. Much colder than it should be at that depth." I paused, hovering in the water. How cold are we talking? At least 10 degrees colder than the surrounding area. It doesn't make sense. My heart rate quickened, the sound of my breathing loud in my ears. "I'm gonna check it out." "Be careful," Dave warned. "Remember, we're not equipped for." His voice cut off abruptly, replaced by static. I tapped my earpiece, but the communication line remained dead. Alone in the silent depths, I hesitated. Every instinct screamed at me to turn back, to ascend to the safety of the boat and my team. But I'd come too far to give up now. Taking a deep breath, I swam forward. The cold hit me like a wall. Even through my wetsuit, I felt it seeping into my bones. My teeth chattered, and I had to concentrate to keep my breathing steady. The beam of my flashlight seemed to dim, barely penetrating the gloom ahead. And then I saw it. At first, I thought it was just another piece of debris, perhaps the remains of an old cabin that had sunk to the bottom of the lake. But as I drew closer, the shape resolved itself into something unmistakably human. A body, seated upright on the lake bed as if it had just decided to take a rest. The tattered remains of clothes hung from its frame, swaying gently in the current. But it was a mask that made my blood run cold, a hockey mask, cracked and covered in algae, but still recognizable. Jason Voorhees. It had to be. My mind raced. This was it. Proof that the legend was real. We'd be famous. But more than that, we'd finally put to rest a mystery that had haunted this lake for decades. With shaking hands, I reached for my underwater camera. I had to document this, to show the world what we'd found. As I raised the camera to my eye, my elbow brushed against the figure's shoulder. The head turned. I froze, my finger hovering over the shutter button. It must have been the current, I told myself. Just the water moving the body. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. Slowly, terribly, the figure's eyes opened. I screamed into my regulator, kicking backward in panic. My elbow hit a rock, sending a jolt of pain up my arm. The camera slipped from my grasp, disappearing into the murk. The figure, Jason, began to rise. It moved with a fluid grace that should have been impossible for something dead for so long. Water streamed from the holes in its mask as it turned to face me fully. I turned and swam, my fins kicking up plumes of silt behind me. My heart pounded in my chest, threatening to burst. I had to get to the surface, had to warn the others. Something grabbed my ankle. I was yanked backward, my regulator nearly coming loose from my mouth. I twisted, lashing out with my free leg. My foot connected with something solid, and for a moment, the grip loosened. I caught a glimpse of Jason, looming over me in the darkness. One hand reached for my throat, the other raising a rusted machete that gleamed dully in the beam of my flashlight. In desperation, I hit the release on my weight belt. Suddenly buoyant, I shot upward, leaving Jason grasping at empty water below me. The surface rushed towards me too quickly. I knew I should slow my ascent, knew the dangers of decompression sickness, but terror drove me upward. My lungs burned. Starved for air, I burst through the surface with a gasp, ripping off my mask. "Dave! Sarah!" I shouted, my voice hoarse. "We have to go. Now!" The boat was only a few yards away. I could see Dave and Sarah staring at me, confusion and concern on their faces. "Jack, what happened?" Dave called. "We lost communication." "Start the engine." I interrupted, swimming towards a boat as fast as I could. "He's down there. He's alive." Sarah reached out to help me aboard, but I waved her off. "No time. Just go." As Dave fired up the engine, I risked a glance behind me. The lake's surface was calm, undisturbed. Had I imagined it all? Was it possible that the pressure, the darkness, had played tricks on my mind? And then I saw it, a ripple in the water, moving towards us with unnatural speed. "Go! Go! Go!" I shouted. The boat lurched forward just as a hand broke the surface where we had been moments before. I caught a glimpse of a pale, bloated face and the glint of a hockey mask before we sped away, the roar of the engine drowning out everything else. We didn't slow down until Crystal Lake was far behind us, a dark smudge on the horizon. Only then did I allow myself to collapse on the deck, my body shaking with exhaustion and residual terror. Dave knelt beside me, his face pale. "Jack, what the hell happened down there?" I opened my mouth to explain, but the words wouldn't come. How could I describe what I'd seen? Who would believe me? Sarah joined us, a blanket in her hands. As she draped it over my shoulders, her eyes widened. "Jack, your arm." I looked down. 5 deep gashes ran along my forearm, oozing blood. I hadn't even felt it happen. "We need to get you to a hospital," Dave said, his voice tight with worry. I shook my head. No hospitals. No reports. No one can know what happened out there. "But promise me," I insisted, gripping Dave's arm. "What's down there, it needs to stay down there. We can't let anyone else go looking for it." Dave and Sarah exchanged a look, then nodded slowly. As we sped toward shore, I huddled under the blanket, unable to shake the chill that had seeped into my bones. I knew that the nightmare was far from over. The legend of Jason Voorhees was real, and I had disturbed his rest. In the days and weeks that followed, I would wake in the night, gasping for air, convinced that cold, dead hands were reaching for me from the depths. I would jump at shadows, always feeling watched. And sometimes, when I least expected it, I would catch a whiff of stagnant lake water, and my scars would throb with a phantom pain. We had gone to Crystal Lake seeking answers, hoping to uncover the truth behind a legend. Instead, we had awakened something that should have remained buried. And as I sit here now, writing this account, I can't shake the feeling that someday, somehow, Jason will find me again, because some legends never die, and some nightmares never end. The candles flickered, casting long shadows across the abandoned cabin's walls. The air was thick with the acrid smell of incense and something darker, more primal. I stood at the edge of the circle, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. This was it. The moment we'd been preparing for months. The night we would bring Jason Voorhees back from the dead. "Are you ready, Amber?" Michael's voice was barely above a whisper, but in the silence of the cabin, it might as well have been a shout. I nodded, not trusting my voice. The weight of the ancient tome in my hands seemed to increase with each passing second. Its leather cover was warm to the touch, almost alive. The five of us had found each other online, united by our obsession with the Crystal Lake murders and the legend of Jason Voorhees. What had started as late-night forum discussions had evolved into something more sinister, more real. And now here we were, deep in the woods near Crystal Lake, about to attempt the unthinkable. Michael began to chant, his voice low and guttural. The others joined in, their voices blending into a dissonant harmony that made my skin crawl. I opened the book, my fingers trembling as I turned to the marked page. The words were in a language I didn't understand, but we'd practiced this for weeks. As I began to read, the candles flared, their flames stretching towards the ceiling. The temperature in the room plummeted, and I could see my breath misting in the air. Something was happening. Something was coming. A wind that shouldn't exist indoors whipped through the cabin, scattering our carefully arranged artifacts. I raised my voice, shouting the words now, fighting to be heard over the howling gale. The others, chanting, grew more frenzied, more desperate. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. Did it work? Sarah's voice was small, uncertain. We looked around the room, searching for any sign that our ritual had succeeded. The candles had been extinguished, leaving us in near total darkness. I fumbled for my flashlight, my hands shaking so badly I almost dropped it. The beam of light swept across the room, revealing overturned furniture and scattered papers. But no Jason, no hulking, masked figure rising from the dead. "We failed," Michael said, his voice heavy with disappointment. All that preparation for nothing. I felt a mix of relief and frustration. Part of me had been terrified that it would work, that we'd actually raise an unstoppable killing machine from the grave. But another part, the part that had driven me to this insane endeavor in the first place, felt cheated. "Maybe we should try again," Tom suggested, already reaching for the book I'd dropped. A loud crack split the air, making us all jump. It sounded like it had come from outside. "What was that?" Sarah whispered, her eyes wide with fear. "Probably just a branch breaking," I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. The wind was pretty strong. But even as I said it, I knew it wasn't true. The night outside was still, unnaturally so. No wind, no animal sounds, nothing. Another crack, closer this time. Then another. It sounded like footsteps, heavy and deliberate, approaching the cabin. "Guys," I said, my mouth dry. "I think we should leave. Now." No one argued. We scrambled to gather our things, abandoning the ritual items in our haste. I shoved the book into my backpack, unable to leave it behind despite my growing terror. Just as we reached the door, a shadow fell across the cabin's only window. Something large was out there, blocking out what little moonlight had been filtering through. "Oh, God," Sarah whimpered. "What have we done?" The door exploded inward in a shower of splinters. And there, silhouetted in the doorway, was a figure that haunted the nightmares of anyone who'd ever heard the legend of Crystal Lake. Tall, impossibly broad-shouldered, with a hockey mask gleaming dully in the beam of my dropped flashlight. Jason Voorhees. And he was very, very real. For a moment, we all stood frozen, unable to process what we were seeing. Then survival instinct kicked in and we scattered. I dove behind an overturned table, my heart threatening to burst from my chest. I heard screams, the sickening thud of metal meeting flesh, and the crash of breaking furniture. Peering around the edge of the table, I saw Michael swinging a candlestick at Jason. It connected with a dull clang, but Jason didn't even flinch. His hand shot out, grabbing Michael by the throat and lifting him off the ground as if he weighed nothing. I wanted to help, to do something, but terror kept me rooted to the spot. I watched in horror as Jason's other hand rose, clutching a rusted machete. The blade flashed in the dim light, and Michael went limp. Sarah's scream snapped me out of my paralysis. I had to do something. I had to stop this nightmare we'd unleashed. The book. Maybe there was something in it. Some way to send Jason back. I scrambled for my backpack, yanking the tome out with trembling hands. The pages seemed to turn of their own accord, stopping on a passage I didn't remember seeing before. The words were in English this time, a banishment ritual. But it required a sacrifice, a life freely given to seal the portal we'd opened. A crash from across the room made me look up. Tom had managed to push a bookshelf onto Jason, momentarily pinning him. But already the shelf was moving, Jason's inhuman strength evident as he began to push it off. "Guys!" I shouted, my voice cracking. "I think I found a way to stop him, but we need a sacrifice." Sarah appeared at my side, her face streaked with tears and blood. "What kind of sacrifice?" I swallowed hard. "A life. Someone has to die to send him back." The sound of splintering would told us Jason had freed himself. Tom's scream was cut horrifyingly short. Sarah met my eyes, a look of grim determination replacing her fear. "Do it," she said. "Use me. Just make it stop." "Sarah, no, I can't." "You have to," she insisted, grabbing my arm. "It's the only way to fix what we've done. Please, Amber." Jason's heavy footsteps approached. We were out of time. With shaking hands, I began to read the ritual, my voice growing stronger with each word. Sarah stood, facing Jason, her arms spread wide. "Over here, you bastard," she shouted. "Come and get me." Jason turned, his mask gleaming with fresh blood. He stalked towards Sarah, machete raised. The air in the cabin began to shimmer, a vortex of energy forming between Sarah and Jason. My voice rose to a shout as I read the final words of the ritual. Sarah locked eyes with me one last time, a sad smile on her face. Then Jason was upon her. A blinding flash of light filled the cabin. I felt a rush of wind, heard an inhuman roar of rage and frustration. When my vision cleared, both Sarah and Jason were gone. The cabin was silent once more, the only sound my ragged breathing and the drip of blood from the ceiling. It was over. We'd done it. We'd send Jason back. But at what cost? I sank to my knees, the book falling from my numb fingers. Sobs racked my body as the full weight of what had happened hit me. My friends were dead. Sarah had sacrificed herself, and it was all my fault. I don't know how long I sat there, surrounded by the carnage we'd wrought. Eventually, I managed to stumble to my feet. I had to get out, had to tell someone what had happened. But who would believe me? Who would understand the madness that had driven us to this point? As I stepped out of the cabin into the cool night air, a realization hit me. The book. I couldn't leave it behind. What if someone else found it? Tried the ritual again. I turned back, intending to retrieve the tome and destroy it. But as my flashlight beam swept across the cabin floor, my blood ran cold. The book was gone. In that moment, I knew with sickening certainty that this wasn't over. Jason might be gone for now, but the means to bring him back still existed. And somewhere out there, someone else might be crazy enough to try. As I stumbled through the dark woods, fleeing the scene of our disastrous ritual, one thought kept running through my mind. What had we unleashed upon the world? The legend of Jason Voorhees would live on, and I would spend the rest of my life trying to undo the terrible mistake we'd made on this cursed night at Crystal Lake. The screams echoed through the night, bouncing off the trees and sending a chill down my spine. I reminded myself for the 100th time that it was all fake, just part of the show. But as I stood there in my blood-splattered costume, clutching a prop machete, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. My name's Mike, and this was supposed to be my last night working at Camp Blood, the newest attraction at Fright Night Theme Park. For the past month, I'd been playing one of Jason Voorhees' victims, scaring the hell out of tourists who came to experience the real Crystal Lake. It was a sweet gig for a broke college student, even if the hours sucked and the fake blood was a pain to wash off. But tonight was different. The air felt heavy, charged with an electricity that had nothing to do with the cheap fog machines scattered around the fabricated camp. "Hey, Mike." Sarah's voice crackled through my earpiece. "You're up in 5. Everything okay over there?" I swallowed hard, trying to ignore the knot in my stomach. "Yeah, all good. Just getting into character." Sarah laughed. "Don't get too method on me. Remember, you're supposed to die, not do the killing." "Right?" I muttered. "Dying. Got it." I made my way to my starting position, a small clearing near the fake lake. The set designers had done an amazing job recreating Camp Crystal Lake. In the moonlight, it was almost impossible to tell that the cabins were just facades, the trees mostly plastic. As I waited for my cue, I noticed something odd. The usual ambient sounds, crickets, frogs, the distant hum of the park's machinery, had all gone silent. The only thing I could hear was my own breathing and the pounding of my heart. A twig snapped behind me. I spun around, expecting to see Jake, the guy who played Jason. But there was no one there, just shadows and mist. "Jake!" I called out, my voice sounding small in the eerie silence. "That you, man?" No response. My earpiece crackled to life. "Mike, you're on. Group coming your way." I shook off my unease and got into position. This was just another show, another group of thrill seekers to entertain. I could do this in my sleep. The first scream started right on cue as the group of tourists rounded the corner. I burst from my hiding spot, yelling and flailing dramatically before Jason appeared and killed me in a spray of fake blood. But Jake wasn't there. Instead, a massive figure loomed over me, a real machete glinting in the moonlight. The hockey mask was weathered, cracked, nothing like the pristine prop Jake usually wore. For a moment, I thought Jake was playing a prank, upping the scare factor for our last night. Then I saw the eyes behind the mask. Cold, dead eyes that held no hint of humanity. This wasn't Jake. The tourists, oblivious to the real danger, cheered and screamed in delight. They thought it was all part of the show. I scrambled backwards, my mind racing. This couldn't be happening. Jason Voorhees wasn't real. He was a movie character, a legend. The machete came down, biting deep into the ground where my leg had been a second before. This was real. Too real. "Run!" I screamed at the tourists, my voice cracking with terror. "It's not part of the show. Run!" Confusion rippled through the group. A few laughed, thinking it was an improvised bit. Others, sensing the genuine fear in my voice, began to back away. Jason, the real Jason, turned towards them, his movements deliberate and menacing. That's when the real screaming started. I don't remember getting to my feet. One moment I was on the ground, the next I was running, crashing through the underbrush, my only thought to get as far away from that clearing as possible. Behind me, I could hear chaos erupting, screams of terror mixed with the sickening sound of metal cleaving flesh. My earpiece exploded with panicked voices, my co-workers realizing too late that something had gone horribly wrong. I burst into the staff area, gasping for breath. "Sarah," I yelled, spotting her by the control panel. "We have to evacuate. Call security. Call the police. Call everyone." Sarah stared at me, her face pale. "Mike, what's going on?" The cameras in Sector 5 just went dead, and I'm getting reports of... A blood-curdling scream cut her off. We both turned to see one of the other actors stumbling towards us, clutching a bloody arm to his chest. "He's real." The actor gasped before collapsing. "Jason, he's real." What followed was a blur of panic and horror. Sarah hit the emergency alarm, its wail mixing with the screams echoing from the park. Security guards rushed past us, armed with nothing more than flashlights and radios, woefully inadequate against the nightmare that had invaded our fake Camp Crystal Lake. I should have run, should have fled to safety with the others. But I couldn't shake the guilt. We had built this place, turned a tragedy into a tourist attraction. Somehow, we had awakened something that should have remained buried. "Sarah," I said, grabbing her arm as she tried to herd people towards the exit. "The lake. The real Crystal Lake. It's not far from here." She stared at me, realization dawning in her eyes. "You think that's where he came from? That we somehow drew him here?" I nodded grimly. "We need to lead him back. It's the only way to end this." Sarah shook her head. "That's insane, Mike. We need to get out of here. Let the authorities handle this." But I knew, deep in my gut, that no authority could handle this. This was our mess, and we had to clean it up. Ignoring Sarah's protests, I grabbed a flare gun from the emergency kit and headed back into the park. The once cheerful attractions now loomed menacingly in the darkness. Every shadow seemed to hide a hockey mask killer. I made my way towards a real Crystal Lake, the sound of distant screams spurring me on. Twice I had to hide as Jason's massive form stalked past, his machete dripping with fresh blood. Finally, I reached the shore of the real lake. Its waters were black in the moonlight, still as glass. This was where it all began, where young Jason had drowned so many years ago. Taking a deep breath, I raised the flare gun and fired. The night sky blazed red as the flare arced over the lake. "Jason!" I yelled, my voice echoing across the water. "I'm here! Come and get me!" For a moment, nothing happened. Then I heard it. The heavy, methodical footsteps I'd come to dread. He was coming. Jason emerged from the tree-line, his mask gleaming dully in the fading light of the flare. He paused, seeming to recognize his surroundings. "That's right," I said, slowly backing into the water. "This is your home, isn't it? This is where you belong." He started towards me, his pace quickening. I retreated further into the lake, the cold water now up to my chest. "Come on," I muttered, "just a little further." Jason reached the water's edge. For a moment, I thought he would stop. Then, with a determination that chilled me more than the lake ever could, he began to wade in. I waited until he was waist-deep before diving to the side. Jason's hand grazed my leg as I swam past him, heading for the shore. But I had underestimated his speed. A hand clamped around my ankle, dragging me back. I thrashed wildly, my lungs burning for air. In that moment, faced with my own mortality, a strange calm washed over me. I stopped fighting. Instead, I grabbed Jason's arm and pulled. We sank together, deeper and deeper into the black waters of Crystal Lake. Jason's grip never loosened, even as the pressure built around us. As my vision began to darken, I saw a shimmer in the depths below. It looked almost like a portal, a gateway to somewhere else, somewhere Jason belonged. With the last of my strength, I kicked out, propelling us both towards that shimmering light. As we passed through, I felt Jason's grip finally loosen. I don't remember breaking the surface. The next thing I knew, I was on the shore, coughing up lake water as paramedics swarmed around me. Jason was gone. Whether he had returned to whatever hell spawned him, or simply sank to the bottom of Crystal Lake, I'll never know. Part of me doesn't want to know. In the days that followed, as the media descended on Fright Night Theme Park and the authorities tried to make sense of the tragedy, I kept silent about what I'd seen in the depths of the lake. Who would believe me anyway? But sometimes on quiet nights, I find myself drawn back to the shores of Crystal Lake. And as I stare out at its placid surface, I can't help but wonder, did we really banish the evil or just postpone its return? One thing's for certain, I'll never look at a hockey mask the same way again. The craving hit me like a sledgehammer, my hands shaking as I gripped the edge of the rickety bunk bed. Sweat beaded on my forehead, and I could feel the familiar itch crawling beneath my skin. Day 3 at Crystal Lake Rehabilitation Camp, and I was already falling apart. "You okay there, Jack?" my roommate Mike asked from the bottom bunk. His voice was laced with concern, but I could hear the underlying tension. We were all on edge here, a bunch of addicts trying to get clean in the middle of nowhere. I forced a weak smile. Yeah, just, the usual. Mike nodded sympathetically. He was here, kicking a nasty heroin habit, while I was trying to shake off a decade-long dance with the bottle. Different poisons, same hell. Group session in 10. He reminded me, climbing out of bed. Might help to talk it out. I doubted it, but I nodded anyway. Anything was better than sitting here alone with my thoughts and the relentless call of addiction. The Crystal Lake Rehabilitation Camp was a last-ditch effort for most of us, set in the remote wilderness, miles from the nearest town and, more importantly, the nearest liquor store or dealer. It promised a chance at recovery through a combination of therapy, outdoor activities, and good old-fashioned isolation. What they didn't mention in the brochure was the camp's history. Whispered conversations among the patients told of a dark past, of a boy who drowned here decades ago, and a series of gruesome murders that followed. But those were just stories, urban legends to spice up our dreary days of battling withdrawal and facing our demons. At least, that's what I told myself as I made my way to the main cabin for group therapy. The session was a usual mix of tears, anger, and tentative hope. I sat in silence, half listening to the others bare their souls, while I wrestled with my own inner turmoil. The counselor, Sarah, kept shooting concerned glances my way, but I avoided her gaze. As the session wound down, a commotion outside caught everyone's attention. Raised voices, the sound of running feet. Sarah frowned and went to investigate, leaving us to speculate among ourselves. Bet someone tried to make a run for it, Mike muttered. Happens every week or so. But when Sarah returned, her face was pale, her usual calm demeanor shaken. Everyone, I need you to remain calm and stay in the cabin. There's been an incident. The authorities have been called. A ripple of unease went through the group. What kind of incident? Someone asked. Sarah hesitated. One of the night staff was found injured, severely. We're implementing lockdown procedures until help arrives. The cabin erupted into a cacophony of questions and exclamations. My own anxiety spiked, the need for a drink becoming almost unbearable. This was exactly the kind of stress that had always sent me reaching for the bottle in the past. As if reading my thoughts, Mike leaned in close. Hey, man, we're gonna get through this. Just breathe, okay? I nodded, grateful for his support, even as another part of me was calculating how long it would take to reach the staff's quarters where I knew they kept medical supplies, including alcohol. The next few hours were a blur of tension and fear. Nobody knew exactly what was happening, but rumors flew fast and wild. Some said it was a bear attack, others whispered about a patient going berserk. And then there were those who brought up the old legends, speaking in hushed tones about Jason Voorhees and his undying vengeance. As night fell, the camp fell into an uneasy silence. The police still hadn't arrived. Apparently, a storm had washed out the only road leading to the camp. We were on our own, unable to sleep. I found myself wandering the campgrounds, ignoring the strict orders to stay in our cabins. The full moon cast long shadows across the camp, turning familiar sights into looming monsters. That's when I saw it. A figure moving between the trees at the edge of the camp, tall, unnaturally still, with something glinting on its face in the moonlight. My blood ran cold as I realized what I was seeing, a hockey mask. I blinked, sure I was hallucinating. It had to be the withdrawal, my mind playing tricks on me. But when I looked again, the figure was closer, and I could see the massive machete clutched in its hand. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to sound the alarm. But I was rooted to the spot, my addiction-addled brain struggling to process what I was seeing. The figure, Jason, my mind gibbered, turned its head towards me with a deliberate slowness that sent chills down my spine. For a long moment, we stared at each other across the moonlit clearing. Then, with a speed that belied its size, it charged. I ran. Blind panic lent me speed I didn't know I possessed. I crashed through the underbrush, branches whipping at my face, my lungs burning as I gasped for air. Behind me, I could hear the steady, relentless footsteps of my pursuer. I burst into the main clearing of the camp, screaming for help. Lights flickered on in the cabins, confused and frightened faces appearing at windows. "He's here!" I yelled, my voice cracking. "Jason's here!" Doors flew open as patients and staff alike emerged, drawn by the commotion. But as they looked around in confusion, I realized with dawning horror that there was no sign of my masked pursuer. "Jack!" Sarah approached cautiously, her hands raised in a placating gesture. "What's going on?" I spun around, searching the tree-line. I saw him. Jason Voorhees. He was chasing me. A murmur went through the gathered crowd. I saw the looks they were exchanging: pity, disbelief, concern. They thought I was hallucinating, having some sort of breakdown. "Jack," Sarah said gently, "there's no one there. You're safe. This is just a withdrawal playing tricks on your mind." But I knew what I'd seen, didn't I? As the adrenaline faded, doubt began to creep in. Had it all been in my head? Was I finally cracking under the pressure of sobriety? The next few days were a nightmare of paranoia and self-doubt. Every shadow seemed to hide a hockey mask killer. Every unexplained sound sent my heart racing. The other patients gave me a wide berth, whispering when they thought I couldn't hear. Only Mike stood by me, but even he couldn't hide the worry in his eyes. "Maybe you should talk to Sarah," he suggested one evening. "Get some extra help." I nodded numbly, knowing he was right but terrified of what it might mean. Was I losing my mind? That night, unable to sleep, I found myself drawn once again to the shores of Crystal Lake. The water was black in the moonlight, still as glass. As I stared into its depths, I felt a strange sense of peace wash over me. "Beautiful, isn't it?" I jumped at the voice, turning to find Sarah standing nearby. She offered a small smile. "Couldn't sleep either?" I shook my head, turning back to the lake. "Do you believe in ghosts, Sarah?" She was quiet for a long moment. "I believe that we all have our demons," she said finally. "Some are just more tangible than others." As if on cue, a ripple disturbed the lake's surface. We both watched transfixed as the ripples grew larger, moving towards the shore. And then I saw it, a hand, pale and bloated, breaking the surface. Sarah's sharp intake of breath told me she'd seen it too. This was no hallucination. As we watched in horror, a figure began to emerge from the lake. Water cascaded off broad shoulders, glinting off the edges of a familiar hockey mask. "Run," Sarah whispered, her voice tight with fear. "Run!" We turned and fled, the sound of heavy footsteps splashing through water spurring us on. As we reached the main camp, Sarah began shouting, rousing everyone from their sleep. What followed was chaos. Screams filled the air as Jason, the real undead Jason, stalked through the camp. Patients and staff alike fell before his relentless advance. In the midst of the madness, I felt a strange calm settle over me. For the first time in years, the craving for alcohol was gone, replaced by a singular focus: survival. I found myself rallying the others, organizing a defense, leading a counterattack. In facing this external demon, I found the strength to conquer my internal ones. As dawn broke, it was over. Jason had vanished back into the depths of Crystal Lake, leaving behind a scene of carnage and a group of survivors forever changed. In the days that followed, as the authorities struggled to make sense of what had happened, I realized something profound. We had come to this camp to face our demons, never expecting to encounter a real one. But in doing so, we had found a strength we never knew we possessed. I looked around at the other survivors, Mike, Sarah, and a handful of others. We were battered, traumatized, but alive. And more importantly, we were sober. As we were loaded into ambulances and police cars, I caught Sarah's eye. She gave me a weary smile and a nod of understanding. We had faced the ultimate test and come out the other side. Our battle with addiction wasn't over. It never would be. But after facing Jason Voorhees and living to tell the tale, A life of sobriety didn't seem so daunting anymore. As we left Crystal Lake behind, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. Whatever challenges lay ahead, I knew I had the strength to face them, one day at a time. The EMF meter in my hand chirped frantically, its lights flashing like a demented Christmas tree. I exchanged glances with Sarah, our team sensitive. Her face was pale, eyes wide with a mix of excitement and fear. "Holy shit," she whispered. "We've got something big here, Jake." I nodded, trying to keep my own excitement in check. After years of investigating haunted houses and abandoned hospitals, we'd finally hit the jackpot. Crystal Lake, the infamous site of the Jason Voorhees murders. It had taken months of negotiation and a small fortune to get permission to investigate, but if this reading was anything to go by, it would be worth every penny. "Mike, you getting this?" I called out to our tech guy, who was fiddling with a camera nearby. He gave a thumbs up, his face ghostly in the glow of his equipment. "Crystal clear, boss. Whatever's here, we're gonna catch it." I grinned, adrenaline coursing through my veins. This was it, the episode that would put our little paranormal investigation show on the map. No more scraping by with YouTube ad revenue and Patreon donations. We were about to hit the big time. If only I'd known then how right I was, and how much I'd come to regret it. We set up our equipment around the remains of Camp Crystal Lake. Cameras with night vision capability, audio recorders, motion sensors, the works. As the sun set, painting the lake blood red, an eerie stillness settled over the camp. "All right, team," I said, gathering everyone around. "We'll start with an EVP session at the main cabin, then move to the lake. Sarah, you feel anything specific we should focus on?" She closed her eyes, brow furrowed in concentration. "There's so much pain here, anger, a presence that's waiting." A shiver ran down my spine, but I pushed it aside. This was what we'd come for, after all. "Okay, let's do this. Mike, you're on camera duty. Sarah, stick close to me. John, keep an eye on the monitors back at base camp. Everyone stay alert and call out anything unusual." As we made our way to the dilapidated main cabin, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The trees seemed to loom closer, their branches reaching out like gnarled fingers. Even the chirping of crickets had fallen silent, as if the whole forest was holding its breath. Inside the cabin, the air was thick with dust and decay. Our flashlights cast long shadows that seemed to move of their own accord. I set up a digital recorder on a rickety table and cleared my throat. "This is Jake Thompson, lead investigator for Paranormal Seekers. We're at Camp Crystal Lake, site of the infamous Voorhees murders. If there are any spirits present, we mean you no harm. We're here to communicate and understand." The silence that followed was oppressive. Then, so faint I almost missed it, a whisper. "Get out." I froze, locking eyes with Sarah. She nodded, confirming she'd heard it too. "Did you hear that?" I asked, my voice embarrassingly shaky. "Can you repeat that for us?" Another whisper, louder this time. "Leave, now." Mike swung his camera around wildly, trying to catch something on film. "Guys, I'm getting some weird distortions here. Like, something's interfering with the signal." I pressed on, my heart pounding. "We're not here to disturb you. We just want to understand what happened here. Can you tell us your name?" The temperature plummeted. I could see my breath misting in the air. The EMF meter in my hand went berserk, its alarm screeching in the stillness. And then we heard it, a sound that would haunt my nightmares for years to come. Heavy, deliberate footsteps coming from right outside the cabin. "Jake," Sarah's voice was tight with fear. "We need to leave, now." But it was too late. The cabin door exploded inward in a shower of rotten wood. And there, silhouetted in the doorway, was a figure that couldn't possibly be real. Tall, impossibly broad-shouldered, with a hockey mask gleaming dully in the beam of our flashlights. Jason Voorhees. and he was very, very real. For a moment, we all stood frozen, unable to process what we were seeing. Then survival instinct kicked in. "Run!" I yelled, grabbing Sarah's arm and pulling her towards the back of the cabin. Mike was right behind us, his camera forgotten in the rush to escape. We burst out the back door, the cool night air a shock after the stifling cabin. I could hear Jason's heavy footsteps behind us, methodical and unhurried. He knew he didn't need to rush. We were in his domain now. "The van!" Mike gasped. "We need to get to the van." But as we rounded the corner of the cabin, my heart sank. The van was a good 100 yards away, across open ground. We'd never make it. "The lake," Sarah panted. "The legends say he can't leave the camp if we can make it to a boat." It was a long shot, but it was all we had. We veered towards the shore, our feet pounding on the worn dock. An old rowboat was tethered at the end, bobbing gently in the dark water. I scrambled to untie the rope, my fingers clumsy with fear. Behind us, Jason's footsteps grew louder. "Hurry," Mike urged, his eyes wide with terror as he stared back towards the shore. Finally, the knot came loose. We piled into the boat, nearly capsizing it in our haste. I grabbed an oar and started paddling frantically, not daring to look back. The sound of splintering wood made me flinch. Jason had reached the dock. "Oh, God," Sarah whimpered. "He's coming." I redoubled my efforts, my arms burning with the strain. The shore seemed to recede agonizingly slowly. A splash behind us. I risked a glance back and immediately wished I hadn't. Jason was in the water, moving towards us with terrifying speed. "He's supposed to be afraid of water," Mike yelled, his voice cracking with hysteria. "That's how he died." Clearly, the legends had that part wrong. We were halfway across the lake now, but Jason was gaining on us. I could see his mask just breaking the surface, like some nightmarish shark. And then, miraculously, he stopped. For a long moment, we all held our breath waiting. Jason remained motionless, treading water about 20 feet from our boat. The boundary of his domain, I realized. We'd made it. As if sensing our realization, Jason slowly raised one hand out of the water, and it was Mike's camera, somehow still intact. With deliberate care, Jason crushed the camera in his fist, the crunch of electronics clearly audible in the night air. Then he sank beneath the surface, leaving only ripples to mark where he'd been. We sat in stunned silence, our ragged breathing the only sound. Finally, Sarah spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. What do we do now?" I looked back towards the shore. In the moonlight, I could just make out the silhouette of our van. All our equipment was still there, thousands of dollars worth of cameras, recorders, and sensors. More importantly, all our evidence. For a brief, insane moment, I considered going back for it. This was the proof we'd been searching for our entire careers. Irrefutable evidence of the supernatural. We'd be famous, rich, respected. But then I remembered the sound of Jason's footsteps, the inhuman strength with which he'd torn through the cabin door, the cold, implacable purpose in his movements as he pursued us. Some truths weren't meant to be known. Some legends should remain just that, legends. "We row to the far shore," I said finally. "We hike out to the main road, and we never, ever speak of this again." Mike opened his mouth as if to protest, then closed it, nodding slowly. Sarah just stared out at the dark water, tears streaming down her face. As we rowed away from Crystal Lake, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, not just by Jason, but by something older, something that had used the hockey mask killer as its instrument, a malevolence that had nearly claimed us and would surely claim others in the future. We had come to Crystal Lake seeking ghosts and had instead awakened something far worse. Our brush with the supernatural had cost us our equipment, our show, and nearly our lives. But we had escaped with a knowledge that would burden us forever. Some urban legends are real, and some are better left unexplored. As the first light of dawn broke over the trees, I made a silent vow. Our ghost hunting days were over. Let others chase fame and fortune in the shadows. We had seen the darkness that lurks at the edges of our world, and we would spend the rest of our lives running from it. After all, some things are better left buried, especially at Crystal Lake,